Today I want to introduce one of the new features of the JBoss 5X series of application server, and that's what we call our virtual deployment framework. So what I want to go through today is basically look at what our old deployer model was in terms of our legacy deployers in the 4X and earlier line. Take a look at our new aspectized deployment very quickly. There's a lot of details to that, so we just want to touch on some of the basics that make that basically our fundamental mechanism for extending the JBoss application server. Talk about some of the key aspects of those deployers, which are the structure recognition, how to identify a deployment, looking at its metadata attachments driven mechanisms. We'll talk about how deployers are ordered, basically how they act as an assembly line on top of metadata. And then the last piece is ROI deployers, which are the last piece or the last element in the chain that take the metadata and actually instantiate the components and install those into a component model. I'll touch briefly on the fact that in JBoss 5, the component model is no longer just MBeans. It's basically anything that you have a deployer for, right? So we can introduce multiple component models, and I'll talk a bit more about that tomorrow. The deployers themselves are first-class beans with tight integration into the kernel, with ability to take advantage of its dependency injection for configuring the deployers, as well as dependency management between deployments, which is another aspect that we weren't able to address in earlier versions of JBoss. And lastly, we'll go through a quick demo that basically shows how easy it is to add a new custom component model. In this case, the JSR 299 WebBeans deployment model. Right. So a quick overview of our old deployment model is shown here. Basically, for each type of component or deployment type that we handled in the 4X series, we would have a sub-deployer implementation of this interface. And it's relatively monolithic, and the key things I just want to point out is that one, it wasn't MBean bound to that type of component model. It had to be basically a JBoss service MBean, so we have an object name there. You had a fixed set of suffixes that basically identified what were the names of the deployments we could handle, right? So it was tightly coupled to a name, a suffix of the deployment. And then basically the deployer had to be responsible for all the lifecycle aspects of that deployment. So that's all the way from taking it to, here's a deployment, an AGB jar or WAR file that have to parse, generate the metadata, instantiate all the components, and actually bring that to the running state. Right? So each deployer was a relatively heavyweight thing in JBoss 4X. So the problems with that were, again, it's very monolithic, so it's very difficult to add new component models. So basically the JSR 299 is really an extension of several different existing containers. It adds a new component model, which are the beans, a very simplified POJO, but it can also adapt existing EGBs. It has to integrate with servlets for injection. It has to manage the context of those components across both the EGB tier and the web tier. And that was a very difficult and tedious aspect if we were going to try and add JSR 299 to JBoss 4X or earlier. Class loading configuration, again, was completely up to that component, the deployer itself. So if there are inconsistencies between deployment models and the different types of deployments, that could introduce problems with if I had a WAR trying to talk to an EGB deployment and that type of thing, if they weren't in ear. So there was, it wasn't as clean on how I manage my class loader namespace across deployments. We only really basically supported that one component model, the MBean component model. EGBs and servlets were, kind of leveraged on top of that. Certainly one of the biggest problems is that the management view was very poorly defined. Really there was no proper management API or notion in JBoss 4X and earlier. We basically kind of hacked it on. If you look at how the John console supports JBoss 4X, it basically has to go in and look at the deployment descriptors of the deployment and overwrite them. So it's very tedious and error-prone for it to have to do that. And again, one of the main things is that it's not very extensible because you basically, one deployer, an EGB deployer, had to basically handle all the aspects for an EGB jar deployment. So in JBoss 5, what we did is completely redid the deployment model to introduce this aspect deployer chain. The fundamental notions there are that we have a series of structure deployers that are basically responsible for identifying the virtual file system view of the deployment. So that includes notions of, what are the deployment contexts that have interesting information like the metadata locations. So an EGB jar has a meta-inf directory that's going to contain all of the descriptors related to that deployment. A WAR is going to have a web-inf directory that has the classes, the libraries, as well as the deployment descriptors. And then there's a separate stage of deployers that are what we call the component deployers, which basically go and generate metadata and then ultimately take that metadata and create the components, the actual runtime components that are live in the kernel, the underlying microcontainer. So one of the new things, or one of the key aspects of that assembly line or aspectized deployment model is that deployers are broken up into stages, and then within a stage they're ordered by what we call inputs and outputs, which are basically the metadata that they're interested in manipulating, as well as that an output is the metadata that they are emitting, for consumption by a deployer down the line. Okay. So the new deployer interface looks like this. The key things that are relevant to what I'm going to talk about today is that a deployer has a stage, and I'll go over all the stages, and then it has inputs and outputs. And again, the inputs are the names of the metadata types that it wants to manipulate. So that'd be things like JBoss metadata for web, for EGBs, JBoss web metadata for WAR deployments. Class loading metadata is a new metadata model that basically is our extension of the OSGI bundle and Java module system view of class loading. And basically you can introduce whatever metadata types that you want. And we'll take a brief look at that. And outputs are basically the output, the metadata type that you output. And you can certainly output the metadata that you input, so you basically have a filter, right? You don't necessarily have to produce new output. One of the other things that the new deployers support is multiple deployers can manipulate the metadata or state of a deployment. So any number of deployers in a stage are going to get their deploy called with a deployment unit. And the deployment unit is basically a collection of two things: attachments, which you can think of just as a map of metadata, and then they have a correlation with some notion of the deployment structure, right? So the most common view of that will be our virtual file system view of the deployment. Okay. So the deployer stages that exist are, the initial state, which is not installed; parse, which is the basic entry point for the component deployers. That's where we basically take the existing externalized deployment descriptors in whatever form they exist. That can be class files, that can be XML descriptors, that can be any custom format of metadata, and then we transform that from the persistent view to basically the in-memory POJO metadata view. Post parse is typically where you'd introduce transforming deployers. So say I want to manipulate the EGB jar model, but I don't want to have to parse the whole EGB jar model, including the JBoss customized view of that model. I'll get a raw metadata view of the EGB deployment that I can then come along and manipulate without having to worry about what was the externalized view or format of that deployment. Pre-describe is where I can introduce dependencies on other components, which can itself include other deployments. So that's a new aspect of this framework, is that deployments themselves are actually components with their own component model that run through a state machine and lifecycle.